So, have you guys ever noticed that the Great Pyramids and the Giza Plateau, Cairo, is 100 miles away from the ocean? I just think that's kind of weird, even though it is on the Nile, you can still access it by boat. But a lot of the major cities of the ancient world had access to the sea. I've covered in other videos how it was customary in the ancient world to put the mausoleums and tombs of important people on the main road going into a city. And I would guess that there is an entire city underneath the sand when it looked like this in the oldest known photographs. So I'm just going to speculate that the pyramids might have been oceanfront property at the time that they were built, and we're going to look into that. I'm not the only person to have considered this. This is a pretty interesting video here. If anybody wants to check it out, Historiographer. It's definitely a very interesting take on ancient events, but I'm just going to pull this part out of the video. So the pyramids are right there where the sub button is. And this is his take on what the ancient shorelines actually look like. Right here in what is now just all dry desert, you have what's known as Whale Valley. In this location, there are petrified logs all across the embankment that were the ancient shoreline, because the logs basically, they get petrified through a waterlogging process. And then in this location, there were numerous holes of boats found buried in the sand. Now, I don't know if I agree with his entire map of the shoreline, but here's what I see here. I think this whole Nile Delta could have been deposited all in one big event. And that this was probably the ancient shoreline at the time the pyramids were built. Now, let me explain something on the timeline here. Alexandria is a port city named after Alexander the Great, so I think this delta has been here for the whole time of our ancients, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and all of that. And that the pyramids could have came from the previous world age, like the Noah period. And wow, I know a lot more about this now than when I started this video last night. That was as far as I made it, 2 minutes. Yeah, Herodotus just 100% confirmed my suspicions here. So we'll get to that. You see how all of the pyramids are right along the edge of the Nile Valley, like at the base of the delta. And here's one of the oldest photos I could find of this, but that completely looks like water erosion, what used to be an ancient shoreline there. This would have all been underwater, and this little feature right here looks like a rock slide after the water was gone. But let's talk about alluvial fans. This is from Randall Carlson's channel, Geocosmic Rex, and he talks about this alluvial fan in Death Valley near Mormon Point, hundreds of miles from the ocean today. But this is accepted geology that all of this used to be shoreline along the what's now bluffs. Down below is a bed of salt from stagnated salt water drying. And then you have this 2-mile wide alluvial fan. There's another one right next to it. There's a lot of these around here. So at one time, this was all covered with ocean that apparently dried slowly. Otherwise, the salt would, if it rushed out, it would not be a salt bed. But then sometime after that, there had to have been a deluge of water from either rain or tidal wave, whatever, that came down quickly and brought all of this sediment down with it. Now look at the Nile Delta again. What I see is the ancient shoreline, and the Nile was probably quite a bit wider at that time. So something happened upstream. And I mean, the Nile goes for thousands of miles, but there was a huge deluge picking up all of the silt, all the muck, and deposited it out here, creating new land. Right now, the Great Pyramids are 5 miles away from the Nile River, and they used to ship everything, including stone, on water. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to be 5 miles away. So I think this was all Mediterranean and a very large Nile running into it right here. And one could easily speculate that sea levels were higher back in this time. On the elevation maps, the floor of the delta where it's pointing is 12 meters above sea level, and it's 200 miles of flat farmland like in the picture. The green is the lower elevation, and you can see that V shape where it's transitioning to the yellow and red, the higher elevations, the ancient shoreline. And what do you know? I got to looking around, and some recent archaeological finds do have the lost city of the pyramids buried under there. And they've probably known about this for 100 years, and they do that a lot with archaeological digs. They will literally seal something back up. They say for posterity's sake, so future archaeologists can investigate further, or just because it's not jiving with their current paradigm. Anyway, you can see where it says the reconstruction of 4th Dynasty waterways. What I've always heard is they built canals leading to the pyramid, but when I looked up trying to find any of these canals, all it brought up was the Canal of the Pharaohs, which is on the other side of the delta, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But canals for the purpose of building the pyramids may be just pure speculation. I found some really recent archaeological information out, which is kind of surprising because they keep this place under lock and key. But in this study, they say that, yeah, the ancient city of Giza was a port city. Now, they're saying that it was a port off the Nile, and just pure speculation on my part, but, what if it was a port that was actually on the ocean at that time? Several discoveries suggest that Giza was a thriving port, and this basin may be an extension of a harbor or waterfront. They also found charcoal remains of cedar, juniper, pine, and oak, all trees that grew in that part of the Mediterranean back when Africa had a very different climate. Here's a map of the ancient Great Lakes of Africa, and according to mainstream science, this was all millions of years ago, which I'm going to guess is around 5,000 years ago, around the Noah event. That seems to be where all our history starts officially, but it was just picking things back up, the broken pieces, But if you had a green Africa at the time that the pyramids were built, then it wouldn't be surprising to find cedar and juniper and all of those trees being burned. In that study, they also found big buildings they were assuming were barracks, but when they found all of the charcoal from the different woods, they say, I wonder if we're basically seeing not barracks of the workers, but of elite crews of ships, because when you live in a hot, dry desert, the trees are kind of hard to come by and are pretty valuable. So they're saying that, well, they must have been rich people to be able to afford to have a fire. Maybe the official timeline is off. You've probably all heard that there's water erosion on the Sphinx, and evidently that's a fringe theory that is attributing the water erosion to the fact that Atlantis sank. What? See, that's what they do to make everything sound stupid. I think most people look at it and say, well, it probably rained or there was water flowing by here, and it doesn't have anything to do with Atlantis. Anyway, back to the even crazier idea that the Nile Delta wasn't even there when the pyramids were built. Here's a photo of just a textbook erosional study to where all of the sediment was lifted up, simulating a flood, and then deposited out. And you see how it fans out there. You flip it over, and it's the exact same shape as the Nile Delta. Now let's look at what Herodotus has to say about it. It seemed to myself, also according as the priest said, that the greater part of the delta had been won as an addition by the Egyptians, for it was evident to me that the space between the aforesaid mountain ranges which lie above the city of Memphis once was a gulf of the sea. We should thereby declare that in former times the Egyptians had no land to live in, for as we have seen in their delta, at any rate, is alluvial, and has appeared, so to speak, lately, as the Egyptians themselves say. So Herodotus is saying that they must not have really had very much land to live in without the 100 miles of Nile Delta out there, because the only land worth living on is the current Nile River Valley. Just a mile or wide, strip of good soiled land on each side of the Nile in our modern times. But I say if this was green Africa at the time the pyramids were built, then things were much different and they had all kinds of land out through here. You know, now the Giza Plateau is just barren wasteland. What if it was thick forest back in the day? Herodotus continues, I have observed that Egypt runs out into the sea further than the adjoining land, that's the V shape I was talking about, and the shells are found upon the mountains of it, and an effervescence of salt forms upon the surface, so that even the pyramids are being eaten away by it. Oz Geographics channel has a couple videos out exploring Bright Insight's theory of a tsunami that went across Africa and has found, possible evidence of the chevrons and whatnot. And you can see a impact in the Mediterranean, theoretically, that washed over Africa like this, but it kind of leaves out what happened to the Nile, because if all that water came up the Nile Valley, well, then it's coming back down too. Another contender is the Berkel crater off the coast of Madagascar. And with this one, it's pretty widely accepted that a mega tsunami has formed the landscape. You can see the ripples here, but those ripples are 400 and 500-foot tall hills. And coincidentally enough, they date this around 5,000 years ago, which is 3000 BC, which is basically about the time that our current history begins. Another thing I wanted to show you guys was the Pharaoh's Canal. There was an ancient man-made canal connecting the Suez Gulf over to the Nile Delta. Just so you know, the Nile goes up to the left, and then there's several branches by other names there, which, if I'm right, and it was ancient ocean, then it just connected to the ocean instead of one of the small branches off the Nile River. And this is an amazing feat of engineering. I mean, surely they had to use locks because there'd be tide going up and down on the Suez Gulf. I had to look that up, and I guess I'm just flat out wrong. I guess somebody will have to explain to me how clueless I am again, because the Red Sea is connected down to the Indian Ocean, and that's the same water level, no difference in tides with the Mediterranean. That just seems, that's kind of crazy. But anyway, yeah, the pharaohs used to have their own canal connecting over to the Suez Gulf, and speculating that it might have just went to open sea there at that time. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I think the pyramids might have been on the water, and we'll just end off with some photos here that show there's basically crap buried everywhere around the pyramids. In some of these, it really does look like every little mound is a buried something, That's a whole mountain on top of some ancient city there. I don't know how else to look at it. And this is a different side of the Giza Plateau than you ever get to see. What I did was just I clicked on the photos that are attached to Google Maps, so you see what other people have been there and taken their photos and uploaded. And I've seen quite a few videos of Egypt, and everybody kind of focuses on the same things, but that's a whole bunch of stuff buried out there. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you on the next one.